religion, sexual orientation, or any other characteristic. Christian is the host of Pensive Politics podcast, where he gives quick-witted and philosophically rich commentary on issues such as free speech, criminal justice, CRT, wokeness, and others. His frequent cultural and political analysis can be found on his YouTube page titled Christian Watson. He recently graduated from Mercer College, where he was the head of the Students for Liberty chapter, a member of the debate team, and an opinion writer at the Mercer Cluster. He travels the country for TFAS, speaking on college campuses as an outreach fellow. His talk today is titled The Delusion of Diversity Politics. So please welcome Christian Watson.
Well, hello everyone. How you guys doing this morning? Very good, very good. So the title of this talk is The Delusion of Diversity Politics. And for this talk to be meaningful to any of you, I have to kind of define what that means. And to define what that means, I have to define what diversity means. Now, this is a topic of contention in America today. I'm sure many of you are quite aware that the word diversity appears in almost every single institution and every single social circumstance. Almost every single institution has a statement about it. Some people have made it almost their sort of religious goal to ensure diversity exists. And I think this is kind of a fallacy, because by the virtue of having a society, diversity already exists. I look out in this room and I see so many different faces. I see so many people who probably have vastly different life experiences. And any coherent society is going to suppose these things. Any coherent and successful society is going to require these things. But the idea of diversity today has unfortunately been distorted and twisted to no longer mean having a variety of different skills or life experiences that one possesses, and to mean something entirely different that one has no control over, and that means to be tied to skin color or any other immutable characteristic. There are two domineering perspectives about diversity today in American politics. One comes from the right, and that basically says, just going to give a very brief overview. Of course, there are more than this, but just for concision, I'm going to give a brief overview. It says that diversity of thought, which assumes equal opportunity, is important. This has kind of been the argument from the right for the past 50 to 60 years, ever since the civil rights movement and the situation surrounding affirmative action, so on and so forth. The other argument says that diversity is in fact based on having representation, that's a term that's oftentimes used today, of a variety of different people and different identity groups. So for example, someone who may believe that diversity of thought is important may want to have a liberal and a conservative in a particular political setting or a particular social setting to share their perspectives. Someone who believes that diversity of skin color is important may want to have X amount of black people involved in a certain setting to share their perspectives. This idea comes from the idea that if you have a certain identity, you therefore have certain experiences. This is the idea of lived experience that is actually so popular in today's society. So I actually have a quote from you that actually exemplifies this perspective, because I don't want to just pull things out of thin air. And this quote comes from a group called Inclusive America, which actually pushes to increase the amount of diversity in politics, diversity being the left-wing version that I just told you about. And they say the following: diversity is important because 93% of all candidates running for federal government were white, and 80% were male. Inclusive America believes that diversity and inclusion in government results in an increase in political efficacy. Political efficacy is defined by Inclusive America as the belief that one's civic participation leads to meaningful social change, further stabilizing our democratic processes. According to the same organization, which is the sort of representative of this viewpoint, diversity in politics is important for several reasons. Number one being that it boosts political efficacy. I'll explain that in a second. I don't think that's quite correct. Number two, that diversity is important because people can see themselves in the representatives. It makes them want to participate in our processes more. Again, I have some problems with that, and that's the basic crux of it. Well, the first thing is, if people need to have someone in positions of power that looks like them to be able to trust in our processes, they didn't have much trust in the first place. America is based on the principle of universal natural rights, that all men, by virtue of being rational agents, the only creatures on this world who have been able to conquer nature and create civilization from its measure, that these things are universal to every single one of us. Many of us are quite familiar with this philosophy, whether it comes in the Declaration of Independence, whether it comes from just the general sensibilities of the Civil Rights Movement, or whether it comes from a sort of common sense understanding of how human beings work. Most folks don't go through life believing that your race defines you. Most folks don't go through life believing that your immutable characteristics define you. In fact, data supports this. Over 90% of Americans, if you compare the numbers to 50 or so years ago, have no problem having a neighbor of a different race. Over 96% have no problem with interracial marriage and so on and so forth. Those numbers were vastly different 50 or 60 years ago. And so the American experiment kind of presumes certain things that if you're going to be a true, philosophically committed American, you must endorse. If you do not endorse those things, the processes are not the problem. Your mindset is the problem. The second problem with this philosophy is that it assigns value, again, to skin color. Now, allow me to say something. It is indisputably true that in America, throughout its history, there have been different experiences that different people have had. Some of those experiences in this country have been based on skin color. I think anyone who would deny that is someone who's not a student of history or just doesn't care about the facts. But to essentialize and reduce every single person's experience to a characteristic that they did not choose, and to not acknowledge the richness of the human experience, is to, I think, completely miss the entire point of studying society. As I mentioned, society is simply a bunch of the sort of summation of a bunch of different interactions coming together to create a bigger, more fundamental process. I think the philosopher Friedrich Hayek was actually quite correct in his theory of spontaneous order. That really reflects what society is. And so if we're going to have that understanding of society, we're going to understand, yes, racism has existed. Yes, race has indeed been used to deny certain people certain things. But that is not the whole of all black people's experience. That is not the whole of all whatever identity characteristic you want to replace it with. But unfortunately, for a lot of people who have this sort of left-wing idea of diversity that I talked about, the whole of their experiences, a lot of it is based on how power structures have influenced the sort of path of black Americans or other Americans, and that really is a mistaken viewpoint. There are some people who would say, me speaking on this topic as I do means I am identifying with white supremacy. Larry Elder, the gubernatorial candidate for California a few years ago, was called a black white supremacist by one of the flagship publications of his state, the LA Times. And this idea comes from that you're identifying with the cause that is against you, even if you don't bear the skin color that they're accusing you of supporting or whatever. And this comes from a broader idea of believing diversity is based on things that you don't control and not things that in fact distinguish us, that are inherent to all of our differences. So I think we've reached a point in this speech where I can actually define the title, diversity politics. Diversity politics is the idea that we need to have a political system that reflects identity characteristics as opposed to universal values that are inherent in that system. Now, this idea is diluted because, as I mentioned, America is indeed a system that is based on universal principles. One of the biggest arguments that I see against this idea is that the founders owned slaves. Therefore, them owning slaves is evidence of America not actually living up to its principles. But this argument really confuses two fundamental things. Number one, you can have a universal statement of values that not everyone lives up to. Human beings are inherently imperfect creatures. Human beings are bound to fail at some things. It doesn't matter how much you fail. It doesn't matter how much you stumble. It matters what you do with that. Thomas Jefferson owned several slaves, had a mistress. And yet, how can someone with that disposition write some of the greatest words penned in tribute to human freedom that this world has ever seen? Well, because, again, human beings, I believe, are vessels for higher ideas. And so to ignore the sort of efficiency of these principles by looking at the people who wrote them completely misplaces these principles in the first place. America will never truly be a racist country in principle because America's concept is not attuned to racism. America's concept is actually fundamentally opposed to racism. America's concept is actually one of the few concepts, political concepts in the world, that I would say robustly reinforces itself against racism. This is why, during the Civil Rights Movement, Dr. Martin Luther King actually made several appeals to the Constitution and to the American dream in his arguments against Jim Crow. I mean, imagine if he had no foundational basis by which to argue against these policies that had overtaken the country. And that foundational basis was found in the United States. It was found in our first principles. And that's one of the bigger issues that I think this idea of diversity politics completely ignores, is first principles. If you don't have a solid foundation to work off of, your house will fall down. Unfortunately, I believe right now America's first principles are being challenged and changed in as much that the house is potentially going to fall down. I mean, we just saw what happened with Tyree Nichols, and we saw that all of the officers who abused him, who were black, are now being called symptoms of a broader system of white supremacy. And any kind of argument against that effect is met with derision and scorn, and that derision and scorn is accepted by a lot of academics these days. It's accepted by a lot of people these days, which is why I'm so happy that all of you are here, because I believe groups like TFAS are actually a counterweight and a counterbalance to that kind of stuff. We have to understand that there are certain truths about reality, certain truths about politics that America presupposes that are not negotiable. All men are created equal, regardless of their particular differences. That's not negotiable. Reality can be discovered through reason and empiricism. That's not negotiable. The fact that America is the greatest, tribute to human freedom in history, that's not negotiable. There are just certain things. We have to have a baseline of understanding in order to make society work. Diversity politics doesn't care about that. Diversity politics is entirely about power. It's entirely about pitting groups against each other in this sort of oppressor-oppressed dynamic. Many of you may know this as intersectionality, that presumes that certain people have less of a stake and more of a stake in politics due to the so-called collective experiences of their group characteristics. Once again, that completely negates the first principles of our country. And that completely negates the first principles of our political system. Our political system is not meant to be a system that caters to some and doesn't cater to others. It's meant to be a system that reinforces its foundations and ensures that the people, through the principle of popular sovereignty, are represented faithfully and fully by their representatives. Now, for many reasons that the course has been deviated from, but the vision is still there. And that is a vision that I believe, as a constitutional conservative, that I can call back to, that I can look back to and be inspired with. But the diversity politics people don't care about that vision whatsoever. It's no longer about pursuing the universal principles. It's about instead making sure X group of people is doing okay as opposed to other group of people. It's making sure that equity flourishes. Now, I mentioned earlier a few moments ago, that the morning's early, that the left-wing perspective on diversity assigns certain valued universal characteristics to immutable characteristics. And part of that value is the idea of equity. And there's been this tension recently between equity and equality. And I think that whenever you see someone who proposes the idea of diversity politics, they're going to mention equity. So I'm not sure how many of you are quite familiar with this idea of equity versus equality, but for those of you who are not, I'll just say very briefly. Equity is the act of discriminatorily redistributing resources to some people at the expense of others. Equality is the behavior of assuming that everyone has an equal moral status and you are particularly blind to any individual advantages they may have. You want them to be on a level playing field. Equity argues that due to America's history, everyone is not on a level playing field, and therefore equity is required to ensure social justice. Well, again, the problem is that you don't have any kind of justice with discrimination. Justice is quite literally, if we want to use a literal definition, the protection of individual rights. And how that happens is by assuming that we all have natural equality, by assuming that all human beings are on an equal playing field. If someone gets an advantage that someone else does not get, that is not justice, that is discrimination. And I thought that the Civil Rights Movement just fought for so many years to fight back against that kind of ideology, to say, no, I will not have to go to a certain fountain because I am black. I want to be able to go to the same fountain as the other people. Now, before I close, I think that it's very important we talk about discrimination, segregation. Critical race theory has become an important part of the diversity politics narrative, and it was actually pretty huge. I'm sure many of you remember. And many folks don't realize critical race theory was actually created as a response to the civil rights movement. It was created as a response to integration. In the late 70s, early 80s, critical race theorists basically were saying that integration hurt black folks. Derek Bell, basically one of the people who crafted critical race theory, was actually saying that he believed that black children would be better under segregation than integration. And critical race theory was quite literally built on this illiberal notion that separation is actually better. Now, they try to hide that. They try to just say, that's not true, but that's functionally what's happening. We see all around the country where you have certain events that are blacks only. There was this movie that came out a few years ago, I think Wakanda or whatever, and there were quite literally people saying, if you are white, do not go to this movie because that's disrespectful to black people. This is where the diversity politics narrative leads you. It leads you back to a mindset of segregation. And America is not a segregationist country. America is a universalist country that proudly proclaims certain virtues that are necessary for free societies to flourish. The diversity politics narrative does not simply fail because it wants to go back to Jim Crow. It fails because it rejects the very essence of what America is. And anyone who loves America should reject the very essence of what that is to remain true to that idea. That's it. Thank you.
Hello, Chris Ullman here.
Hello.
So to the extent that a lot of our discourse today is I'm right and you're wrong, which is rarely reality, do you find any of the logic of the diversity crowd to have either fact, logic, or validity to it?
Well,
any part of it, like even 5% of it?
Well, you know, fundamentally, we all work with the same information. Well, we used to work with the same information. I should probably say that. I probably say that. The premise of the diversity crowd is going to be wrong no matter what. But some of the things that they point at are actually quite correct. It is quite correct that black folks were systematically excluded from certain things 50, 60 years ago. That's correct. And again, anyone who ignores that is not a student of history. They just want to live somewhere, I don't know, I don't want to go that place. But to then, therefore, extrapolate so many different things about the American experiment from that fact, that America is inherently evil, that it's white supremacist, that it's imperialist, whatever buzz term they want to use, is just incorrect. So it's okay to look at the facts of history and try to deal and reckon with them in a serious way without aggrandizing them and drawing conclusions that fit one's ideological narrative about the country as opposed to fitting reality. So that's my perspective on that.
Thank you for sharing with us. Really appreciate it. When you think about the future, if the future could be this diversity of thought and the equality, or if it could be both, do you think we can land in a place where there's diversity of thought and experience so that people can feel represented, but it's also based on they're in the right position? And do you think we can have both equality and equity live in harmony?
I'll answer the second question first. You cannot have equity if you have equality. Equity is quite literally the discriminatory distribution of certain resources to certain groups that you believe are more oppressed than other groups. Equality wouldn't have room for that. If you're going to have everyone on an equal playing field, you cannot prop up certain people at the expense of other people. So there will never be any tension. In my opinion, if people affirm a classical liberal view of the world, or really of society, then there can be no tension. So one of my favorite philosophers, Karl Popper, he had this idea of the paradox of tolerance. And that is, if societies have intolerant ideals within them, tolerant societies are more prone to have intolerant ideas within them, which could then therefore jeopardize their foundations. And I think that a lot of this is true. Now, I think there's a way to deal with this without actually banning any ideas, because he wasn't actually arguing for that, neither would I. But there are just certain things that can't be compromised with. If you're going to have a political system based on equality, you cannot therefore say, okay, black folks, you had it bad, let me give you reparations, let me give you houses, let me give you, Michael Eric Dyson suggested that white folks open up savings account for black people and just give it to them, that kind of stuff. You can't have that, because that goes against the foundations of America. And quite frankly, it's also stupid, because there's no one alive today that was a slave. So, no, you'll never have those two things exist. And the other question was about, can we have diversity of thought and experience? And of course, I think that diversity of thought actually presumes experience. I think that diversity of thought actually presumes that you have a lot of different people that have a lot of different intellectual experiences that they can share. You know, I want to have the black nationalist right next to the American patriot to talk out. That's the essence of what a pluralistic society is about. And right now, there is a move, I think on both sides of the aisle, to get away from that kind of pluralism, because some people believe that it's kind of caused social deterioration. But I think, again, as Mitch Daniels said yesterday, you don't have any kind of knowledge production without the clash of ideas. That's necessary. And I'll go even further. You don't have the truth without clashing ideas. The truth is only found in fire, in my opinion. So, yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the 1619 project and your views?
Oh yeah, so the 1619 project is, for those of you who don't know, I'm sure most of you do, was a sort of curriculum started by Nicole Hannah-Jones. Basically, it's a bunch of essays from different professors about certain topics in American history. One of the premises of this project is that America was started when the first slave ships came in 1619. So I'll just say this project is ahistorical, it is almost historically illiterate, it is I want to try to use words that aren't too mean, but there's nothing good about this project. I think that it's meant to propagandize the masses. In the same way that the communist propagandists of Stalin's day and of Mao's day try to propagandize the youth, there's no value in it whatsoever. There is certainly value in asking the question, how could a country that affirmed these sort of universal principles then also affirm chattel slavery? That's a very valuable question that I think that many historians and philosophers have answered. But there's no value in saying, no, America was actually born on the slave ship. And that's the fundamental assumption of the 1619 project. There are several essays in the project written by people that I think are more politically motivated than they are historically motivated. I think that it's possible to have political views and still be a scholar and still have good work, but it's not possible, in my opinion, to be a good scholar and infuse your work with your own biases entirely. That's not possible. All human beings are biased, but I think that if you're going to have good academic work, you should try to rein them in so that your students or the people that are looking at your work are not taken down a path that they themselves did not choose. And that's what the 69 project does. So I don't think that it's good at all. I think that it's bad. It's fine to ask the fundamental question, what was the slave experience in America? But it's not okay to presume an answer of that question in the premise, which is a circular argument, which is exactly what they do. So I'm not in support of that project whatsoever.
Ann Pierce. People in business and law and medicine and education and you name it, they all seem to know that in the culture you're not allowed to say what you say. And you are supposed to support diversity politics with all these various talking points. And what just amazes me is that everyone does it. And so many people are doing it who don't really believe in it. And do you have any thoughts on when we became so conformist and just unwilling to say what we really think? I just don't remember America being like that when I grew up.
Yeah, I don't know the exact date when it started, although for my job I do a lot of research. And I do know that DEI efforts have been measured financially going all the way back to 2005. And in 2005, DEI was a $1 billion industry. Now, did you see much of that in 2005 culturally? I don't think so, at least not everywhere, because we didn't have social media as prevalent back then. I mean, there were a lot of things back then that were not, information didn't flow as seamlessly as it does right now. I'm sure many of you remember that. So, and also culturally, the country was a very different time. You had George Bush, Dick Cheney, you had different presidents, all kinds of different things. But now, in the internet age, as my generation has grown up, and I think that this is really a problem of how we've grown up. A lot of people born after 1999 were raised with a computer or a cell phone in their hand. And that, in my opinion, that's fundamentally destructive. Because not only did that statistically deteriorate the attention spans of those people, it also gave them a sort of simplified view of the world. That's why so many Gen Zers love TikTok. because it's 60 seconds, doesn't require any thought, doesn't require any intellect. You can just go ahead and scroll, and anyone can say anything. Anyone can accuse a professor in Idaho of being the murderer of students and being a psychic, and they can say that they can get followers, clicks, and likes, even if it's entirely not true. They can create all these pronouns, all this kind of stuff that makes absolutely no sense, and when put under a sort of microscope, would fall apart. So that's fundamentally the problem, in my opinion. When you have a generation whose attention span has been degraded intentionally by these systems, and that is weaponized by social media companies to sell them things, then you can also have political activists try to sell these same people things through those means. And we should really look at that, in my opinion. I think that we should return to philosophical thinking in our society. We should return to sort of trying to reckon with the questions of reality that our founders reckoned with. And I think that through that way, I think people would still disagree, obviously, but you would see much less uncritical enforcement by the cultural thought police that you now see.
I mentioned fantastic talk.
Thank you.
A very, very coherent and comprehensive array of arguments, and I think exactly like you. So much for diversity. But anyway, I'm working with I told you last night, some Gen Z guys, the youngest is 17, was 16, who are trying to reach conservatives and libertarians and grow the base using things like TikTok. They're their domain experts on our side, trying to do that. And I've wrestled with the same paradox that you mentioned. Is if you have how do you communicate something in 7 seconds when you're trying to communicate a whole rich array of things that are predicated upon understanding Western Civ and our, and the founding, America and our founding documents.
Yeah, in my opinion, look, there are a lot of conservative influencers on TikTok. I don't blame them. I don't disparage them. That's their thing. And there's no problem going to where people are. Unfortunately, TikTok has surpassed YouTube and any other social media platform as the go-to place for Gen Z. So you have to go where the people are. It's no mistake that the Biden administration quite literally hired TikTokers to promote their COVID message for them. They went where the people are. And so if they're going to do it, we should also probably do it. As a general principle, that's not a good idea. But in this case, it is a good idea. Yeah, we don't want to become the enemy. And unfortunately, I think many people on the right have no problem becoming the enemy. That's a problem. But generally, in this case, we need to do that. But how can we do that in a way that reflects a rich message? Personally, one of the people that I admire so deeply is the late William F. Buckley Jr. And unfortunately, I don't believe our media environment is suitable for someone like him these days. It breaks my heart to say that, but I spend many hours during my free time watching Firing Line, and the fact that he could have public officials on and speak about Boolean logic is just like where did this go in our culture? Where did it go in our culture? I mean, he had Jerry Brown, the former governor of California, and before that, I'd never seen Jerry Brown in a kind of context, and I was actually impressed with him for once in my life. I'm like, wow, he could do all that, but we don't have that kind of figure in our society today, and I really wish we did. I think that the younger generations would benefit from it. I think that everyone in general would benefit from it, but the social mediaization of our politics has really deteriorated the level of discourse, and that has consequences. That's severe consequences. I'll give you one example of this. A lot of people are very keen to say there's going to be a civil war in America. Now, many of those same people don't realize that the last civil war was actually precipitated by very serious disputes that go all the way back to the Constitutional Convention. We don't have those same disputes in our society. It is true, we do have a lack of cohesion on a certain level in many parts of our society, but a lack of cohesion is not enough to cause, I think, the kind of conflict people are saying it will cause. But the reason why people think this is because of how bad how the discourse social media has gotten. And that's just not a very accurate depiction of the world, in my opinion.
This might not be quite right on topic, but what's your view of the reparations movement that's going on, particularly in San Francisco? Is that going to be really divisive? Do you think that'll go anywhere? Has it got legs? Reparations, what do you think?
There's so much to say on this topic. I could actually do another talk on it. Will it go anywhere? Under this current political environment, no. Even when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris had both houses of Congress, that there was a committee by Sheila Jackson Lee on it. It didn't seriously go any further than that, and it shouldn't go anywhere. I was not a victim of slavery. No one that I know is a victim of slavery. No one that someone I know knows is a victim of slavery, that's still alive at least. And I think that should settle it. But at the crux of reparations is actually a fundamental question of justice, because oftentimes you'll hear people who actually support reparations say that reparations is not a punishment, it's righting a wrong. Okay, well, in order to right a wrong, you have to have someone who did wrong and someone who was aggressed. And in that interpersonal context where we find justice, reparations wants to completely go outside of that interpersonal context, keep it on an abstract level, and indict people on the basis of group characteristics. You don't right wrongs by involving people who had no role in those wrongs, and you don't right wrongs by taking the principle of justice, which is very important outside of the interpersonal context. As I mentioned, justice is simply the process of ensuring that man's individual rights are upheld, and along with that his contracts are enforced, and along with that his promises that are also enforced by, that the ones that are particularly enforced by law are also kept. Justice is not distributing resources to certain people. This idea of distributed justice, that's not what it is, because that's not a part of the original principle. So, and the idea of justice that I support is more so the Enlightenment one, that our founders understood, that Locke and natural law theorists understood. And I think that's the only proper theory of justice that we should be basing anything off of, in my opinion.
Thank you so much for a very compelling talk.
Thank you.
And so I wanted to say, I came to the US in 1983, and at that time I reported back to my family that I thought Americans had a certain sense of right and wrong that was the same throughout, regardless. I don't think that's the case anymore. But now, going back to your talk, do you go with this to people who are on the other side of the spectrum, and how does that go?
So I'll say something about what you first said in the second question. It's interesting that when you said you come to America, people had a more collective sense of what right and wrong was. Any society that exists requires a baseline. And this is kind of what critics of the classical liberal experiment get right, as much as it pains me to say that. That classical liberalism doesn't necessarily require virtue as part of its foundations. It simply requires non-coercion. That means do not try to interfere with me or take my stuff. Well, that's good, and I support that, but when you don't have people of good character who do other things that may fall out of the non-coercive sphere, that could still hurt society. So how do you handle that? And I think our founders, they believe that you handle that by encouraging the voluntary growth of social institutions, whether it be marriage, whether it be families, whether it be other kind of different community outings. The founders believe that's how you keep, a virtuous populace amidst a system that is strictly against coercion. But unfortunately, there has been a deterioration, and a lot of people now have their own ideas of what morality and right and wrong are. Now, it's been this way for a very long while, but it's more exemplified due to the social media factors I was mentioning. And that's unfortunate. I think that you have to have a basic sense of what is morally correct to exist in a society. You have to know that it's wrong to take other people's stuff. But not only that, but it's wrong to defame someone. It's wrong to smear someone. It's wrong to, try to, exploit someone. Things that may not be strictly covered by the non-coercive principle, that's wrong too. And we should encourage a sense of personal morality in people, through good examples, things of that sort. if we're going to have a good society. Now, the other thing, I discourse with folks on the other side of the aisle all the time. Sometimes it's very productive. Even if I don't change their mind, it's very productive. Sometimes it's actually pretty harsh. So I've been on the Young Turks several times. I dealt with one of their personalities, and 2 times actually. And throughout the entire thing, he was sneering, he was smearing my name, he was trying to say that I was doing this, on his show for reasons that are not true, things of that sort. And it's unfortunate, but I look at other left-wing personalities, and that's the same kind of thing, because our media environment encourages that kind of gotcha, right? It doesn't encourage actually thinking and reflecting and investigating, which is one of the reasons why I lament the loss of Buckley, because that's exactly what he encouraged. He encouraged thinking, reflecting, and investigating, and also debate. You could have debate with all of those things. These days, debate is it's not that. Debate is more of a competition to embarrass other people in the public mind. So I do try to discourse as much as possible, but a lot of people that I've run into tend to be very, as we would call, bad faith, and that's unfortunate.
Bob Kruger. So I read a lot of Thomas Sowell, and one of his theses is that there never has been in history between groups an equality of outcomes. Are you aware, are you ready of what he's written, and what do you think of that?
So I've read a few of Thomas Sowell's books, Civil Rights, Facts and Fiction, Discrimination and Disparities. And I think that he's a very profound, lucid thinker. In fact, I was just talking about this last night. Between Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell, I think that black conservatives and anyone really, and anyone who loves America, had very rich intellectual resources, over the past few decades. And I lament the loss of Walter Williams. He was a brilliant man. He is someone I wish I could have met before he passed away. Yeah, let's cover that. Yeah, he was an absolutely brilliant man. So, but I think that's actually correct. I think equality of outcome is a misnomer, and even equality of opportunity is probably a misnomer too, because equality of opportunity assumes that you can distribute resources in such a way that will assume that every single person will have the same opportunities. Well, life's not like that. Life is inherently diverse. Different folks will have different opportunities based on a variety of different factors. Who are their parents? How wealthy are they? How hard do they work? How hard do they study? There's a variety of different things that go into how successful you are. Let me give you an example. I am a young black man who came from a single mother household. I have several family members who are in jail or who are destitute, and I did not come from money. I worked my way through college, doing triples and all kind of different shifts to make sure I could pay my way through. I studied my butt off, to put it with how to expletive, and I had an entrepreneurial mentality. And now I'm sitting here and I'm speaking. No one gave that to me. No system gave that to me. No system tried taking that away from me. I found my opportunities. I identified my gifts, found my opportunities, and I forged a path forward. I think anyone else in this country can do that if they want to. I think anyone else in this country, if they have that sort of entrepreneurial, self-starting mindset, can succeed and really experience the fullness of life. But you're not going to do that if you constantly believe that you are owed anything. Life owes you nothing. No one owes you anything but kindness and mutual respect, and that's the baseline. Everything else you have to get for yourself. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Christian. Now you know why we are sending him on the road to speak at college campuses, and I encourage the students here, if you want Christian to come to your campus, we have a generous donor who's funding him to go around the country. Please